Magnificat anima mea Domino.
I've spoken to quite a lot of young people, traditional Catholics, who have raised the point that the most common cause of scrupulosity is really with regard to the sins against the sixth commandment, with regard to thought, for example, impure thoughts and things like that. They worry that if an impure thought has entered their mind, that therefore they've consented to it, entertained it, and that it's a mortal sin. I'm just wondering if it might be helpful if you could offer perhaps a guideline for how one can know if one has consented to a thought like that.
Yeah, that's actually that is probably one of the key questions that comes up, and that's my experience too. Is that it usually revolves around the sixth commandment, and part of it has to do with the before I get into that, some of it actually has to do with the fact that traditional Catholics don't want to commit mortal sin, and they don't want to commit sin, and so what happens is when the thought kind of comes in, there is what the demons very often are looking for is when they put the temptation of the impure thought into our minds, what they're looking for sometimes is not even so much the initial consent to the thought, because they know you're more than likely not going to do it. Mm-hmm. What they're looking for is for your reaction in fear that, oh, I could fall here, or, oh, this is dangerous area, or this is mortal sin territory, I got to stop. And then once that fear enters in, then they hold the fear and drive the person to think, oh, did I commit it? Or, et cetera. So that's one of the reasons why they have to really work on courage and hope, among other things, and trust in God, et cetera, which we can talk about some of the spiritual things. But as far as that goes, so when a thought comes into the mind, we don't have any control over that necessarily. I think sometimes you'll get scrupulous people who will say, oh, well, but if I was perfect, I wouldn't have this problem. That's not necessarily the case, because even the saints who reach perfection, even, like Teresa of Avila and some of these other saints that had reached highest levels of prayer, complained about these distractions and that type of thing. And so, and one of the things that people have to realize is that even when we reach a certain level of perfection, God, St. Thomas says, in order for us to maintain a virtue, but also to continue to grow in the virtue, will allow the temptations to come from time to time. So people, it doesn't, somebody asked one time, when am I going to be freed of these kinds of thoughts? And they said, when you're dead, that kind of a thing. And I think that it just has, we work on it and we find it so that the initial thought, the entire tradition, the church herself teaches, when the thought first comes into your mind, there's no sin in that, unless I've done specifically something to set myself up for it. But with scrupulous people, very often that's what they'll do is, well, did I do something beforehand? Let this thing in, and that all has to stop, because which I'll get to, what kind of the criteria, but how you can kind of know. The first thought comes in. Then there's this thing called semi-deliberation or semi-deliberate. And basically what that means is, as human beings, our lower faculties, but we can also have can be some of our higher faculties, a thought can kind of come into our mind. And then we have this thing called the cogitative power, according to St. Thomas. It has the ability, he calls it particular reason, to take an image that comes into our mind and start making a series of connections in relationship to it. And it can even cause kind of emotion in the context of the actual image. And so this thing can kind of come into in modern parlance, we would call it daydreaming. So it just kind of comes in. Our higher faculties are kind of checked out. There's nothing really going on. And so it kind of comes in. Because it's in the imagination, our emotions are moved by what's in the imagination. There can be an initial, although it's not a full consent delight, but there can be like this initial excitement, or in the case of the sexual impurity, there can kind of be this initial incitement to those kinds of things, even though it's purely at the level of the lower faculties and it doesn't include the will. So it's not at the level of the sinful, because what is sinful is what's in the will, what the will gives consent to, not what's going on in the lower faculties. So it can kind of go on for a little bit, and then once in a while, our higher faculties can kind of, St. Thomas says, even look at that image and kind of toss it around a bit or think a little bit about it, but it hasn't yet made a judgment that the thing that it's considering is actually grave matter or not. It hasn't made that judgment. And so that semi-deliberate, so a lot of times, especially scrupulous people, that's where they get really confused, that it'll kind of come in and it kind of goes on for a little while and they think, oh, well, I must have entertained it. No, that's not necessarily the case, because entertaining it means that I intellectually made a judgment, this is morally sinful, and then I gave consent, yeah, I want to continue thinking about that. So whereas those other things can kind of go on for a while. So then the last one is full consent or fully deliberate, and that's when I make the judgment, hey, this is grave matter, and then I decide, but I'm going to continue it anyway. That's when it becomes morally sinful. Up until that point, it's not morally sinful. So, but because of the way we're designed and the way God designed our intellectual faculties, basically what happens is when we give full consent, because the intellect at the time grasps, hey, this is what this is, and there's a certain kind of intellectual clarity, hey, this is grave matter, at least at the time. And then I give consent. St. Thomas says we also know the acts of our will. And so when those two come together to have sufficient reflection and full consent, what happens is there's an intellectual clarity. I committed the sin. This is, and it's at that point that we know that it's actually grave. Up until that point, it's not going to be grave because there's always a mitigating, either the intellect doesn't fully grasp it or the will hasn't given full consent. And in each of those cases, the church teaches us that that's not morally sinful, subjectively speaking. And so what I'll often tell scrupulous people is that I'll describe that and I'll just say, look, unless you're absolutely certain, not that you want certitude, because the minute you think, well, I want to be certain about this, you automatically don't have it. If you had the certitude, you wouldn't even want it because you're like, yeah, I know I did, I committed it, right? So, and so that's when I'll tell people, unless you're absolutely certain about this, you are to treat it as if it's not. You are to treat it as not morally sinful because it's not.
Yes.